I want to begin, the focus of the panel is largely going to be on the issue of U.S. policy in Iraq and what the situation is today in Iraq, particularly with a focus on the question of federalism in the country. Before I get into my remarks about Iraq, though, I want to take a moment and talk some about the presidential debate on Friday. How many of you watched the debate? Raise your hand. Okay, that's a pretty good percentage of you that are tuned in to the election this year. I'd like to see 100% of people watching these debates and encourage your friends. I think it's very important that all Americans of voting age today become involved in this electoral process. There was a moment in the debate on Friday evening when the two candidates disagreed with each other over whether they understand the difference between tactics and strategy in foreign policy, in military affairs. I see a number of you shaking your heads. You remember that moment, I think a very important moment of the debate. The two agree essentially that the situation we find ourselves in Iraq today allows us to begin drawing down our troops over the coming years. They've both, at least in what they're saying, they've made statements to that effect, but for different reasons. McCain's position in the debate Friday evening was that the surge has worked. We can come home now as victors, he said. There are signs of social and economic progress in Iraq. Obama takes this position because he says the original decision to invade was a mistake. He's very careful to stress the extraordinary success of our troops in Iraq, what they have done over the last couple of years, especially in the surge. But he said in the debate that that was a tactic to correct mistakes that had been made earlier, mismanagement in the war resulting from our invasion at the beginning. This was the basis of their disagreement about tactics and strategy in Iraq. McCain said, wait a minute, that wasn't a tactic. It was a strategy on our part to go into Iraq and to bring, he said, peace and prosperity to the region and show that we're able to do that. Obama countered again saying the Iraq invasion was a strategic failure from the beginning, especially because McCain and others at the time assumed that al-Qaeda and Taliban had been defeated in Afghanistan. When actually, in the wake of the bombing and the campaign in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda and Taliban within a couple of years had reconstituted themselves. And the fighting there became much more seriously. And of course, as we know today, it is a widespread problem across the region. I can agree with the speakers on the last panel. A number of the countries that they mentioned, I've spent quite a bit of time in Yemen, and I know that it's a very real problem in the country of Yemen, where there is broad-based networks within society that are generally supportive of what people within al-Qaeda think in terms of their anti-American hostility. It's important to think about the implications of McCain and Obama's disagreement on this issue, of whether the decision to move from Afghanistan to Iraq was a strategic or a tactical success or a failure. I think there are important lessons for the next president who's coming into office in terms of what our foreign policy is going to be in the future. The lesson that McCain draws is that the military instrument works. We've shown that we can be victorious. Of course, he thinks that he can be a better leader than George W. Bush and that maybe he wouldn't make the mistakes that George W. Bush did. But he talks in ways that are indications he has intentions, if not belligerent or otherwise, towards Iran and some other countries, thinking in terms of how we might use the military weapon. Obama's lesson is that we have the power to overthrow governments, overthrow regimes, And if there's a rebellion in countries that we have attacked and invaded, our troops are skilled enough at pacification to bring about some sort of stability. But this comes at great cost and terrible losses, both in terms of human life as well as in terms of financial losses as well. I think the predicament that our country finds itself in today with the financial crisis has a lot to do with the foreign policies over the last 7-8 years. We lose as well stature internationally, which has been shown in many opinion polls across the region. Now, for the candidates, I think it's difficult to talk about this issue. It's difficult to talk about failures in American tactics and strategies in general. The voting population doesn't like to hear the focus on the failures. It's much easier to talk about successes. Obama is very careful not to focus so much on this question that he raises about the tactical and strategic failures, I think, for that reason. Being a professor, you know professors are always objective and neutral. We're very careful about what positions we take. You know this applies to the way we grade papers in classes and exams, and also you're familiar with the tendency of professors to remain nonpartisanship, so I'm not going to take a stance on this issue politically. But I will point to a number of studies and research over the last more recently, the last 2 years, dealing with this question. Specifically, the Foreign Policy magazine in Washington, D.C., conducted a survey of national security and foreign policy experts across the country, whether they think that the American invasion of Iraq, the idea of regime change, the idea of preemptive warfare, is a good strategy. And the overwhelming number of experts that deal with this issue think that it was a failure, and that that's not a good policy for the United States to take. There was also a recent study by the RAND Corporation looking at over 600 terrorist groups that have in one way or another gone out of operation, and they found that only 7% of those did so as a result of military action taken against the terrorist groups. 40% were taken out of action because of police work and criminal prosecutions. 47%, the highest, because of the inclusion of people supporting the terrorist groups within political processes and negotiations. And finally, I'd point to the book by Robert Pape, a very important book, I think, published maybe 2-3 years ago, called Dying to Kill, in which he showed that the overwhelming cause of terrorism and terrorist groups that operate in the world has to do with the phenomenon of military occupation, the sense of people being under military occupation. In short, the overwhelming conclusion of research and studies and analysis on this issue indicate that the decision to invade Iraq as a result of 9/11 and become involved in a long-term occupation of this country was an enormous mistake. As I say, there's a consensus on that point within the academic as well as the think tank community of the United States. Turning to the question of Iraq, and I will shorten my remarks on this and then hope to get into a broader discussion in the question and answers, but I want to say a few things before Dr. Karim more generally, and then lead into his discussion, I think, that's going to deal specifically with the question of federalism. I think there's too much focus in our media and politically, in the way politicians talk about the situation in Iraq, on the military issue. And the question of, how are we doing in terms of number of soldiers who are killed or injured, or how many terrorist attacks or bombings there are from one day to another, and not enough focus on the political question, the political process that is going on in Iraq. There's still no resolution of the main political problems within Iraq, I would argue, and that any sense of a military achievement, if it's true there's been some pacification and a reduction in violence, it's not going to mean anything if there isn't some greater progress towards a political resolution. I've been teaching a course over the last 5 years on Iraq specifically in New York before I moved to Florida, but also at Stetson University locally and Rollins College. And I tell my students that within the first year of the United States entry into Iraq, the origins of the occupation, especially under Ambassador Paul Bremer, when the Coalition Provisional Authority was in operation, the United States changed its political plan, what we were going to do, at a minimum 5 times within that first year. If one compares the nature of the Iraqi government in the form that it is today with the old regime, which was an autocratic, dictatorial regime, you'd have to say that the main characteristic today is that the government is highly fragmented with multiple power centers in the country. In some sense, this is by design, I will suggest. I'm not going to say much about this, but maybe in the question and answer I can talk about this issue. In other words, the intention that we went in with, what we were looking for in terms of a more representative government, a democratic government in Iraq. It's also a result of the way it was implemented and some of the problems that came up within that first year or two. What I want to focus on, however, is the contribution to this fragmentation in Iraq that we see politically as a result of the way this government that has been set up operates in practice, how it functions in practice. And there are numerous examples of the continuing problems that you see in Iraq. Oftentimes no consensus within the executive authority, a lack of coordination within the cabinet between different ministries in the country, corruption that is often spread within the ministries as a result of this, and the effect that has on problems with economic development and the inefficiency in really getting things going socially and economically in the country. But most importantly, in terms of the ability to pass legislation because of this fragmentation within the political system. The one example that I will give, and this will lead into some remarks that I think Dr. Karim will address, was in the spring earlier this year. Some of you may have remembered, you may remember when it was reported in the news, and the way that it was reported here, that the Iraqi parliament, the legislative branch of this new government that has been set up, was able to bundle together 3 pieces of legislation. One of them dealt with the budget for 2008. Another dealt with an amnesty law in terms of Iraqis who have been detained and put into prison. And the other dealt with what was called the Provincial Powers Law. And as it was described in the media, it was talked about as though it was an example of kind of horse trading between different groups involved in the political process in Iraq, defined along the sectarian lines that typically we think of the politics ongoing in Iraq between Kurds, Sunni, and Shia. In reality, the legislation that was passed in key parts of it, particularly dealing with this question about the federalism and the provincial power law, represented a different kind of division within the political system and within the government. The primary division on this issue within the parliament, is, from the way that I understand it, is between a group in the country who is very much in favor of federalism, this idea of moving forward into the future with some larger, either tripartite or otherwise regional structure and coordination between these groups in a larger central government, versus members of the Iraqi parliament who are described as nationalists and uphold the former ideals of the old regime about Arab unity and Arab nationalism and that are opposed to this idea of dividing the country along sectarian or ethnic lines. As I'm sure Dr. Karim will explain, when this bundle of legislations was put forward, the Kurdish authorities in Iraq were opposed to this idea. What had been proposed within the parliament, having a chance to speak with him earlier, I heard him describe that it was illegal in some way, the way that this legislation was put forward. What it was described as a success at the time really was otherwise, and the Kurdish president of Iraq vetoed the law dealing with the provincial powers and demanded that the legislation be withdrawn and revised. The general problem, as I see it in Iraq and this issue, is that the question of resolving the local and provincial authorities has been constantly postponed. Deadlines are set up when this is local elections are to be held. The question of which provinces within the country would become part of a number of regional federal government authorities. From 2007 to 2008, and now the latest postponement is to the end of January next year, 2009. In my view, as I see it, the way I analyze this evolving political system that we see in Iraq, this constant postponement of the issue and the problem that comes up within the parliament, the division between the executive authority and the parliament, goes back to the differences within the elections in 2005. That the first election in January of 2005 was held, it wasn't a parliamentary election, it was an election to set up a national assembly to deal with the question of the new constitution of the country. And so the constitution of the country evolved out of that early election. At the same time, in that early election, there were local council and provincial council elections held. And so the early local governments, provincial governments, were set up after that early January 2005 election. But then the parliamentary elections held in December led to a very different structuring of political powers and forces within Iraq, particularly within the parliament, after all, this being the parliamentary elections. And within the parliament, there are more members that seem to support this idea of non-sectarian national unity and are very wary of the idea of dividing the country up into three separate groups. And so there's this resistance within the political system to move forward on the issue. And I see the benefits of potential federalism, but I'm skeptical whether how it will play out in the coming years, whether it can be done peacefully and successfully in the sense of being beneficial to Iraqis economically and socially. In conclusion, I want to say that I agree with recent comments of Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who was mentioned earlier in one of the sessions. That he said that we need to focus on the achievements that we have seen in Iraq, rather than focusing on all the negative things. He said that we should be encouraging the Iraqis to see the glass half full. Today in the newspaper I saw it reported that he's asking that the United States have strategic patience in how the evolving political system, economic system in Iraq will proceed. But I'm not sure, as indicated in my earlier remarks, that there is that sense within America of strategic value or strategic success in what we have achieved so far in Iraq. I will leave it at that. I have a number of other comments that I will perhaps address in the question and answer session, but I look forward to hearing Dr. Karim's response.
Obviously, I'm not a professor or a think tank member, so pardon me if my presentation is not coherent. I'll try to focus more on the Middle East and the Kurdish issue. The Kurdish issue has been a major factor and a major issue in different countries in the Middle East for the past century, but it has not really received the attention that it needs, and therefore it has become a source of instability and trouble in all those countries. The Kurds are, of course, many of you know, are divided among several countries in the Middle East, but they are contiguous. There are 40 million Kurds in the world. The majority of the Kurds live in Turkey. The second largest population is in Iran, and then Iraq and Syria. And there are about 1 million Kurds in diaspora, and there are Kurds in the former Soviet Republic as well. Since the liberation of Iraq in 2003, the Kurdish issue in Iraq has experienced some significant changes. After the fall of the Ba'ath regime and the creation of federal democracy in a constitution that was voted on in a referendum by the Iraqi people, at least 11 million people voted on that referendum and they approved it. And in that constitution, federalism is actually approved. And Kurdistan region is recognized as a federal region within Iraq itself. And we can see the progress that has been made in the 3 provinces that's called KRG, Kurdistan Regional Government Provinces, from security point of view, from economical point of view, and civil society, judiciary, and in every aspect of life in that region. Compare that to the rest of the country in Iraq, and you will see the difference, and I don't need to go into detail what you have seen or what you have heard already. I like to discuss each part separately, since each part of Kurdistan has its own characteristics, but my main focus will be on Iraq. In Turkey, the Kurds have been denied basic human and political and identity rights. Kurdish language was just legalized as a spoken language in 1991. Before that, you could not speak the Kurdish language. There are no Kurdish schools. Kurdish activists and parliamentarians who have been elected as members of parliament in Turkey have been imprisoned for speaking out on the Kurdish issue. The current government of Turkey, the AKP, has promised some changes and have taken some baby steps, but then with those steps they have also taken steps backward when they are threatened by the military. The same party was threatened to be closed by the Constitutional Court for various reasons, but it escaped by a very, very close call. Otherwise, the major political party, which has brought actually stability to Turkey in general, was about to be closed. The only Kurdish political party, the DTP, which is an acronym for Democratic Society Party, that has 20 members of parliaments from the Kurdish region, is actually about to be closed by the Constitutional Court for different reasons, but the main reason is the members of this group advocate a peaceful solution to the Kurdish issue in Turkey. And we believe that Turkey's request for admission into the European Union will further the step for solution of the Kurdish issue in Turkey, as this will bring the European standards into Turkey. At the same time, we ask that the European Union will put strong emphasis on human rights and democracy and Kurdish identity within Turkey, while the United States is taking the right step in encouraging the European Union to accept Turkey. At the same time, it should also emphasize that the right to human rights and democracy in Turkey is essential for stability and for prosperity of Turkey with all its components. In Iran, the Iranian regime does not only suppress the Kurds, it does it to everybody. It's an equal opportunity oppressor and has been doing so since it has come to power. Again, the Kurdish identity in Iran, while the Kurds are recognized as Kurds, and there is even a province in Iran called Kurdistan, which is probably 1/5 of the Kurdish region, but nonetheless, the oppression, there is no Kurdish school, no Kurdish formal education in Iran, and of course the Kurdish areas are isolated completely by the regime, and any expression of dissent and free speech is punished very harshly. There has been execution of minors for speaking out and demonstrating. Amnesty International just issued a very long report about the situation of the Kurds in Iran and what's going on there. Unfortunately, the focus on the nuclear issue in Iran has basically covered all the other atrocities that the Iranian government is committing, and I believe that's one of the mistakes that was made in Iraq. The focus was on mass destruction against a regime that has already used chemical weapons, committed genocide, and oppressed all its citizens. And I hope the same mistake will not be repeated in Iran. With regard to Syria, the Syrian authorities denied that the Kurds exist in that country. There are about 15% of the population are of Kurdish origin, but about 300,000 of these people don't even have Kurdish citizenship. I was just reviewing some scholarship application at the Kurdish Institute in Paris, and one of the applicants was a girl from Syria. She is a Kurd, and she was not given a passport, although her grandparents and parents were all born in Syria. And it says she cannot qualify for Arab citizenship in Syria. Therefore, we give her this something called laissez-passer, which is a travel document. Again, the presence of Syria is full of dissidents. Among the majority of those are Kurds, but other dissidents who oppose the Ba'athist regime of Bashar Assad. Now let's come to Iraq. There is a debate going on in Iraq about the future. The Iraqi government now has been formed after the election of 2005. The president of Iraq is a Kurd. There are ministers in important positions in Baghdad. Deputy Prime Minister, Foreign Minister are Kurds. And there are 55% of Kurds in the Iraqi parliament. As I said earlier, the Iraqi constitution calls for federalism. In this constitution, there is emphasis that the distribution of wealth will be equal among all population, regardless of where that wealth comes from. So the issue of some provinces, particularly the Sunni provinces, will be deprived of the wealth of the country because they don't have oil is really not true, because the Constitution emphasizes the fact that oil revenues will be distributed according to the population and according to the need of the regions. Despite all the positions that the Kurds have in Iraqi government, there has been a lot of tension between the central government and the Kurdistan regional government on a number of issues. As the security is returning to Iraq and Maliki feels more confidence, he is becoming more authoritarian and trying to build some type of organization around him, and actually he believes what he calls, which I think is oxymoron, is central federalism. I don't think such a thing exists in any dictionary, but that's what he's trying to pass on. Recently, he had tried to send some of his forces to areas that are controlled by the Kurdish defense forces, the Peshmerga, which has been absolutely quiet with no violence, nothing else is going on in those regions. Of course, he was rebuffed and he had to be stopped there. But now he is trying to create what he calls supportive sources and sending them to the southern part of Iraq, where the Shias, because they have conflict with the biggest or major Shia organization, which is the Supreme Islamic Council, and that is creating problems. So we can see some signs that the present government is actually turning towards more centralism and to become an authoritarian, and under the name of strong country, Arab nationalism, and they actually even, some of them are even trying to amend the constitution, which says that at present time it says that Iraq is a founder of the Arab League, but now they want to make it that Iraq is a member of the Arab League. We object to that because we believe that only the Arab people of Iraq are part of the Arab world, but the Kurdish part of Iraq are not part of the Arab world. So we have a lot of issues in there to revise it. But the most contentious issue that can create a potential danger and rupture between the relations between central Iraqi government and Kurdistan regional government is the issue of Kirkuk and the disputed territories. Just to give you a short background, during the Saddam Hussein regime, Saddam Hussein tried to Arabize and perform ethnic cleansing in certain areas which he thought were strategically important to his rule, and especially those areas that had natural resources such as oil. So a campaign of Arabization started in those areas whereby he brought Arab tribes from the southern part of Iraq and settled them in places where the Kurds lived. And he expelled the Kurds into wherever they wanted to go, and most of them went into the liberated areas of Kurdistan. So that resulted in expulsion of about 600,000 to 750,000 people from those areas. There was a camp, and then he instituted a campaign. He called it after a verse in Quran, Anfal. And what he did is he basically evacuated every single Kurdish village and deported the people and massacred most of them. According to Human Rights Watch that conducted a research on this, 182,000 people have perished, and we don't know what happened to them to date, and their families are still waiting for them. So during this process of Arabization and Anfalization, Saddam Hussein managed to change the demographic complexion of these areas, among them Kirkuk, Khanaqin, Sinjar, and some other districts. However, after 2003, some of the families, not most of them, but a significant number of these families returned to their homes, while the ones who were brought into the areas, the settlers, remain in those areas, but the Kurds were brought there. And after the election, the complexion changed again. It changed not completely, but it improved to the point that during the election of 2005, the Kurdish Brotherhood list which included Kurds, original Arabs from Kirkuk, and Turkomans and others, to get 66% of the vote, and the rest of the votes were among the Turkomans and the Arabs. So in July of 2008, in the parliament, the chauvinists in the Iraqi parliament, together with the supporters of Prime Minister Maliki, staged sort of tried to stage a maneuver to change the laws that are in the constitution. And what they attempted to do is basically divide the city among ethnic lines. 32% for Arabs, 32% for Kurds, 32% for Turkomans, and 4% for the Christians, which later they eliminated it. However, this was clearly a violation of the Constitution, and actually that vote was taken without informing all the members of Parliament, and it was taken secretly, and that's why the President actually vetoed that, together with the Shia Prime Minister, who is not a Kurd, who is an Arab. They vetoed that. The Vice President, yes, Adil Abdul Mahdi. So the situation is tenuous, and people are very much concerned about what happens when the United States leaves Iraq, particularly in the Kurdish region. We believe that precipitous withdrawal or complete withdrawal will lead to disaster in Iraq. Even the Sunnis who fought the U.S. And were the leaders of the insurgency, now they don't like for this to happen. Some of them say it publicly, but in private meetings, when they meet, they all want the United States to stay there in some form, or at least until there is enough security and peace in Iraq that it can be sustained. in the past 2 years, we have seen a change in the degree of violence in Iraq. There has been significant reduction, of course, we all know. How did that reduction come about? It came about first by Muqtada Sadr, the Sadrist, that he called a suspension of activities against the United States. I think that was a critical factor. The other critical factor was that Sunni insurgents decided that Al-Qaeda is not in their interest, and they formed units among themselves to fight Al-Qaeda, and they were actually able to expel Al-Qaeda from most of the western provinces and Sunni-dominated areas. And now, what will happen to those people now that they don't need to fight? There is a big issue here now. The Prime Minister does not trust them. They don't want to bring them back into the Iraqi army and integrate them there. So their only hope is to stay allied with the U.S. forces there and with the Americans to get them somehow integrated, at least partially, into Iraqi army, and then have the rest of them either return to civil society or go into retirement. But that's a big issue. It's for the next president to deal with, and also for the new Commander General Odierno to deal with, because that can also cause potential flare-up of violence in those regions. It's by no means settled, even though, fortunately, it has decreased significantly, but it can resurface again very quickly.
It seems like under a federated system, it would be enormously complicated to divide up the resources. Now, with oil, that makes sense, but what about agriculture, imports, exports? How could you form equality of money among, let's say, 3 provinces or 3 sections? How would that work?
We hope we will have a free market society in Iraq, and the federal government will have nothing to do with agriculture or collecting revenues from those things. It will be local. And actually, when it used to be local several decades ago, Iraq used to be self-sufficient. Now Iraq imports everything from wheat to oil, cooking oil, and anything, cheese, fruits, vegetables, everything is imported from outside because the government tried to control these things, and it has completely failed.
Well, I guess I would focus on the issue of oil, which I think is the most important issue. I don't know as much about the question of foreign trade and imports and exports. Obviously, it's true that Iraq is a country with enormous oil wealth. There are a few things that oil does that complicates politics. Is that because oil is a source which is highly valuable and easily centralized, what you tend to find in countries that have a lot of oil is a lack of democracy. You tend to find autocratic countries. So it's a huge problem for Iraq to overcome that tendency of oil to breed a kind of autocracy. 2 other issues. One that I'm sure Dr. Karim can better address is that the oil in the north that the Kurds claim and have an interest in is in that province of Tamim, which currently is not part of the Kurdish regional government. And what I understand is that in order for that oil to be used within the Kurdish region, Tamim would have to vote in a referendum to join the Kurdish regional government. Let me give you another issue, if I can recall it. Maybe I'll recall it as you answer that first one.
First, with regard, Tamim is a name that Kirkuk's name was changed by Saddam Hussein to Tamim. He even changed the name. Not only he expelled people, but he even changed the name of the place. So, but then he also gerrymandered Kirkuk. So he put part of it, took part of it and gave it to other provinces, and then connected some 100% Arab districts far away and connected to Kirkuk. But with regard to the Kirkuk oil, the Constitution is very, very clear on that. These people will eventually vote in a referendum, or they are supposed to vote in a referendum, whether they want to join Kurdistan region or they want to stay part of Iraq or become an independent province by an independent region by himself. That's in the Constitution. That part has not been implemented yet. But what it says, the Constitution says that all the explored fields, that includes Kirkuk, Tamim, all the explored fields will be managed by the central government, all of it. That means they make contracts with foreign companies, they collect the revenues, and that goes into a central pool. But that also really applies to the even newly found region, except that the newly found oil in Kurdistan, or even if in other regions, if they form new regions, say in the south, the new found oil fields, then the regional government can make contract with foreign companies or whatever company they want, and then that revenue again will be collected and sent to that central bank or central place where it will be distributed to the population according to, to the number, the percentage
on
of
the same
population.
basis, or is there a different calculation for the new
No.
versus the old oil?
No, there isn't. The only difference is in the existing fields, the central government, they already have. They collect the money, they employ the people and all that. In the new found fields, the Kurdistan regional government can bring companies and do it with them, and they show these contracts to the central government, so they will be aware of it. But the money from all of that, except for the share of the Kurdistan region, will go to Baghdad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is a key.
Like we have
17.
We have 17% now of Iraqi budget for the Kurdistan region, 17%. And the way we do it, but we have an oil minister in Baghdad who wants everything under his control, like it was under Saddam Hussein's regime, and we will not accept that. But the way we're doing it now is we take 17% of whatever we sell, whoever we make contract with, and send the rest of it to Baghdad.
This was actually my third question, was this question about the old oil versus the newly discovered oil. But I think that's absolutely crucial in order for federalism to work. You have to convince the population of the entire country that all of the wealth, all of the resources will be dealt with fairly, because there is that tendency, as I pointed out, for oil to lead towards autocracy. This tendency, as you pointed out, of al-Maliki wanting to have his control, his hands on all of the oil. Going back to the question about Kirkuk, I know you described how Saddam Hussein gerrymandered, in a way, the province of Tamim, and that is true.
And I'm from Kirkuk, by the way. So
yeah. From the city of
Kirkuk, yes.
What I understand is that the primary oil fields in the province are very close to the city of Kirkuk.
Yes.
They're not in those Arab areas that Saddam attached to Tamim province in order to Arabize it in a way. If Kirkuk in Tamim province becomes part of the Kurdistan regional government, what would happen to the former Arab districts that Saddam Hussein added to Tamim? And is there any provision within the Constitution to redivide provinces based on sub-districts?
Article 140 deals with all of that in the Constitution. And basically what it says, it's actually not just Kurdish region where he gerrymandered it. He did it in the Shia areas. You all know Anbar province. Anbar province used to be the smallest and the least populated province in Iraq. Anbar province is 1/3 of Iraq now, because he cut big chunks from Karbala, from Najaf, from Hilla, from those places, and put it all Anbar province. So if Article 140 is implemented, not only Kirkuk will get to vote in the referendum, and those districts who were detached will be reattached, and those that were attached will be going back to their original places.
Can I ask Dr. Karim something? Do you think that an autonomous Kurdish republic in Iraq would satisfy Kurds internationally, Or, I mean, isn't there a broader movement for an independent state?
Well, I think, yes, the answer, yes, it will satisfy most of the Kurds everywhere today are very happy that at least a small part of greater Kurdistan is free. They can go to and visit and invest in and do things. But of course, the countries that we talked about initially, unless they deal with the Kurdish issue in their own country, I think the unrest will continue, the violence will continue. And you all know that today we have a rebellion in Turkey, we have it in Iran, and there is unrest in Syria every day, because you cannot just keep, in Turkey the Kurds are 20% of the population. How you can prevent them from speaking their language, naming their kids Kurdish names? It's not allowed. Those things are not allowed in Turkey.
Okay. Last question.
I wonder, in terms of federalism, I'm not sure if that might actually stop the violence. I heard about a scenario several years ago that the government's concerned about, where the Sunni part of Iraq might ally with Iran, and the Shia would ally with Iran, and the Sunni part could ally with Saudi. What I think of is, a sort of pre-World War I Balkans type situation where each of these groups supports their own proxies. The Turks don't like the Kurds. I'm just not sure. Do we know for sure that a federated state would actually lead to a more peaceful situation?
Thank you. Professor Day, go ahead, take that first, would you?
As I said in my earlier remarks, I remain skeptical about how this project of federalism is going to move forward. In my experience of looking at this issue in other countries in the Middle East and otherwise, the question of how you divide regions within a multi-ethnic or multicultural country, especially on a democratic basis, as opposed to resolving issues, the research shows that it tends to create more tensions. It tends to exacerbate conflicts, and you do find exactly what we've seen over the last 4 or 5 years in Iraq, the civil war type violence, the revenge killings, etc. I want to, you reminded me in asking the question about the issue of federalism, a comment I wanted to make about Dr. Karim's asking about this proposal that El-Maliki put forward of central federalism. Students of American history, of course, know that the origins of our concept of federalism was actually a centralization process. The Federalists were the ones that were in favor of strengthening the central governing authority because they were afraid that this confederation of 13 states, 13 new states, wouldn't hold together. So the whole meaning of federalism actually, in political terms, means the centralization of polity. The more correct term for the type of federalism that's being pursued in Iraq is a kind of confederalism, where separate regional units would have autonomy to run their own foreign affairs in a way, develop import and export relations, etc. So there's a bit of confusion over the terminology about the issue of federalism. Okay. And then finally, if I can just say one other thing, there's a lot of debate on this issue about how federalism works in countries and whether it's good to push federalism along these lines of a kind of ethnic or sectarian conception, or along the lines of an administrative federalism that de-emphasizes this issue of ethnic and sectarian differences. And of course, the American system of federalism is an administrative form of federalism. We don't use federalism in the United States in the way that the Canadians do or other countries do, where it does devolve power to particular regions of a country that have a different language or a different culture. But the evidence shows that that type of federalism can lead to conflict and tensions, and believe it or not, it actually exists in Canada. There's a secessionist movement among the French Quebecois that periodically rises its head and creates problems for Canadians and their federalism.
Professor Karim, we'll let you have the last word then.
Well, I think federalism is, let's just put it this way. Iraq has been a country sort of since for about 100 years, and it has failed. It has failed. It has committed wars against its neighbors, invaded Kuwait, invaded Iran, committed genocide against the Kurds. That's That's what you have, a strong central government, which unfortunately there was a comment before about State Department is better to deal with those issues. Well, that was State Department's choice to deal with the government of Saddam Hussein, with the government of the Shah of Iran. Up to even today, we don't have people we can talk to in Iran because of that old relationship. I think a new approach is real. It's either a failed state or federalism. And it's not only the Kurds who are asking for federalism. The Shias in the south, actually the Supreme Islamic Council is asking for formation of a region composed of 9 states. And they have the majority of votes of those states. And that's why Maliki is trying to instill his people into those areas to prevent that from happening or bribing people.
Okay, thank you, gentlemen.